Welcome back to the Core Online Learning, where we will be continuing our poetry comparison guide and our poetry series as well. So please watch the other videos in the series if you are revising for your power and conflict exam. So we'll be having a look at Checking Out My History and the Emigree, and this is my comparison guide. Again, Checking Out My History compares really well to other poems, and so does the Emigree, but personally, when I teach the poems in pairs, I believe that these two poems compare really well to each other, and again, it just makes it a lot easier for you to remember quotations from poems if you remember what you're going to link it to. So the similarities between these two poems: oppression, corruption of power, power harming an individual, and reclaiming your power. Now, oppression is when you are treated unfairly by authority, and corruption of power is also very similar to that. So we've got in both poems authorities that treat people quite unfairly. And by authorities, I mean people who are in positions of power treating them both quite unfairly. Now, we know the context of both poems. In Checking Out My History, he grew up in a colonised nation, and he was colonised by the British in his home country of Guyana. So when he is talking about his history not being taught in schools, that is a sign of oppression as well, and it's a sign of corruption of power, because the British were not teaching them a broad curriculum that meant they could connect to their own culture. In the Emigree, there are some similarities, although they are sort of more violent. So her country is taken over and she has to flee, and she talks about her city and going back to the city that she was born in, and how she had to flee from that city due to tyrants. And those are people who rule by fear and who often oppress people and harm people. So when we are talking about power harming an individual, both individuals within the two poems, both speakers, feel that they have been harmed by the way they have been treated by people in authority. And we'll talk more about that in a second. However, ultimately both reclaim their power. And by that I mean that they take that power back. And by the end of the poems, there's definitely this tone of triumph, of them really reconnecting and carving out their own path and not allowing these corrupt people to have as much of an influence over them. So, if we start looking at our quotations, we will see corruption and oppression. So we have Checking Out My History on the left and the Emigree on the right. So what I want to zoom in on this quotation from Checking Out My History is the idea of dem or them. That's what he means. So he speaks in his own dialect, which again shows how he's reconnecting to his culture, and he's not ashamed to speak in the way that he would speak and to speak with his accent, because he is proud of where he comes from. So he really purposely chooses not to use that sort of British accent when he's actually writing this down. Now, what I'm going to focus on is dem or them. And he repeats them. Dem tell me. Dem tell me. He's repeating the idea that they are very separate to him. He's using that as a way to show that they are very different. They are an other. There is a massive separation between him and the people who are oppressing him. Also, he then goes on to say what they want to tell me. So, what them want to tell me. I want to zoom in on that word choice of want, because what he's pointing out there is that they made this conscious decision to only tell him the things that they desired, and not necessarily the things that were good for him to know as a young black man growing up in Guyana, as a young Caribbean man growing up in Guyana. So by pointing out they want to tell me these things, it shows that they are putting themselves and their own wants above the wants of their citizens. So that really shows their corruption, and it also shows how he felt oppressed by them, how he was only told certain things and educated in certain ways. And education is a powerful tool, but he misses out on that, and he misses out on the education of his own culture and identity. Then we compare that to personification in the Emigree. So her country is sick with tyrants. By describing it as sick, she is describing tyrants as like a disease and showing that they harm her country. It's a very negative connotation to talk about them like they are a disease, and it really shows how she feels like they have ruined her city, and they have ruined where she comes from. And that idea of ruin and that idea of oppression and corruption is shown in both poems, because they do feel like something was taken from them, that something was ruined for them. And then we move on to the next slide. So we see how this kind of power and corruption is harmful to the individual. So we're going to zoom in on the metaphor, blind me to me own identity. Now, what he's talking about there, he's not being actually blinded, he's being metaphorically blinded, which means that he's being stopped from seeing his own history, his own identity, his own culture. And so when he uses that metaphor, it's a really powerful metaphor to show how they've injured him. And that's what, being blinded is. It's when someone injures you, someone takes away your ability to see. And they've taken away his ability to see his own heritage and his own history. So it also links to oppression, because he feels like they've taken away that identity from him. Now, contextually in the Emigree, we are going to link that to language. So she does say that her language may by now be a lie that's banned by the state. So when she talks about this, when she talks about her language being a lie, I think language is really important. So if we want to get some AO3 context marks and we talk about language, it's really important to a person's identity, and it's really important to a person's culture. So when she talks about her language being a lie that is banned by the state, it kind of shows how everything has been taken from her. And connecting with other people, that's what we do with language. Our language connects us to other people, and that ability has been taken away. They have been told that they are not allowed to speak how they are comfortable. They have been told that they must use a certain language or a certain dialect. And that really does show how they've oppressed them and how they've taken away that identity from both of them. So to both speakers, they have been directly harmed by the actions of these very, very corrupt governments. And then we move on to the end, where they start to reclaim that power. Now, if you've been following along and you want to write all these points up in a sort of essay, however your teacher has taught you to structure essays, then you've got a really clear narrative here. So you've got the idea that there is corruption, you've got the idea that they are harmed, and then you've got the idea finally at the end that they are reclaiming their power. And that's incredibly important by the end of it, because it shows their defiance, the way they're not going to let other people get them down. So by the end, John Agard says that he is carving out that identity for himself. And I like to zoom in on the verb carving, because when you're carving something, it means you're making it, or you are changing it in some way. And it's a very active verb, and it shows sort of a lot of strength here, where he is actively making his own identity. And they took away that identity by not teaching him what he felt he deserved to be taught. But then he's standing up to them by reconnecting now. Now he's out of the education system. So there's that act of sort of defiance there, where he believes that what he is doing now is reclaiming that. And it is a metaphor as well, because you can't actually, carve out an identity. It's a figure of speech. It's a metaphor. So by saying that, he is saying that they cannot take his power away from him. And it's very similar to the Emigree, because we've already talked about the importance of language in the Emigree, and the importance of language to all individuals when they are reconnecting to their culture and their identity, because language does connect us. So this is quite a long quotation, and you don't have to remember this entire thing. Remember, it's not all about quotations. It can be about textual references, as the mark scheme suggests. But there is a moment when she talks about her vocabulary, which is her language, and she talks about carrying it like a hollow doll. So when she's comparing it to this doll, she's using that metaphor to sort of talk about it like it's comforting to her, like children carry dolls to be comforted. But she says it was hollow, so it felt empty. Now, that could symbolize the way a child doesn't know everything about their language yet, but they are comforted by it. She likes speaking in it, even if she doesn't understand it very well, because she feels like she is comforted by it. But then she says it opens and spills a grammar, and soon I shall have every coloured molecule of it. So that does show that when she reconnects with her language, she starts to learn more of it. And by connecting to her language and by connecting to every little part of her language, which is shown in that metaphor of every coloured molecule, the molecule is tiny, it's very, very little. And what she's saying there is every little bit of my language that I have, I'm going to use, I'm going to express. So when she's doing that, she's reclaiming that identity, that part that has been banned by the state and that she's not allowed to use anymore. But she's doing it. She wants to feel connected to that again. So in a way, they're both very, very strong speakers who don't allow this sort of control and oppression to ruin their view of themselves or their view of their cultures and their identities. So again, whilst they compare really well to other poems, they compare incredibly well to each other, especially if you are getting a question about identity or a question about corruption of power or oppression or anything like that, really. So these two link together perfectly well, and I would definitely say they're worth studying as a pair. Now, if you did like the video, please remember to actually like the video and subscribe so you can see the rest of the videos that are going up for power and conflict poetry.